Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with an endocrine system lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1. In this lecture, I will focus on hormones that are made by the pancreas. These two hormones will regulate blood glucose, and so I'll talk about one homeostatic imbalance that results in a disorder you're probably familiar with, diabetes mellitus. So there are two hormones made by the pancreas that control the amount of glucose in your bloodstream. These are insulin and glucagon. Insulin lowers blood glucose, whereas glucagon raises blood glucose. Therefore, we say that insulin is hypoglycemic in its action, and glucagon is hyperglycemic in its action. In addition, there's two hormones made by the adrenal gland that influence blood glucose. These are cortisol and epinephrine, but we will look at those in a separate lecture on the adrenal gland. In this lecture, we will see that insulin and glucagon are the hormones that act throughout the day when you eat meals and during the time between meals. It's cortisol and epinephrine that are considered stress hormones and mainly secreted when meals are skipped or during prolonged starvation. So in summary, one pancreatic hormone is going to lower blood glucose, that's insulin, and the other pancreatic hormone raises blood glucose, that's glucagon. The pancreas is both an endocrine organ and an exocrine organ. Recall from our discussion of epithelial tissues that exocrine glands secrete a substance into a duct which travels to a target location. In the case of the pancreas, its endocrine function is to produce digestive enzymes that will break down lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates in the small intestine. Therefore, the pancreatic duct leads into the lumen of the small intestine. The endocrine function of the pancreas is to synthesize and secrete hormones into the bloodstream. There are specific regions of the pancreas devoted to either endocrine function or exocrine function. The endocrine regions of the pancreas include groups of cells clustered together in what is called an islet of Langerhans. So on the slide you can see lightly stained cells, kind of lilac cells, grouped together, and their nuclei are very apparent, but they're grouped together, and these are called islets of Langerhans. There's many islets of Langerhans throughout the pancreas. The darker cells in between the islets will all make the digestive enzymes and be secreted into the small intestine. So that's the exocrine portion of the pancreas. Now within the islets of Langerhans, there's two separate kinds of cells. One kind of cell is called a beta cell. These are the ones that produce insulin. The other type are called alpha cells, and they produce glucagon. Both insulin and glucagon secretion occur due to humoral stimulation. That is, that there's going to be a level of glucose in the blood that stimulates the production of one of these hormones. When blood glucose level is high, as shown on the left side of the diagram, the beta cells in the pancreas will be stimulated to produce insulin. Now the action of insulin is to lower blood glucose, so blood glucose level will go back down to normal. On the other hand, If blood glucose level is too low, as is shown on the right-hand side of the diagram, the alpha cells in the pancreas will be stimulated to produce glucagon. Now, glucagon will of course raise blood glucose so that the body cells have access to an adequate supply and blood glucose levels will go back to normal. But how do these hormones work? Well, the action of insulin is to stimulate most cells in your body to import glucose from the blood into their cytoplasm so that the glucose can be used for ATP synthesis. When there is an excess of glucose in liver cells, insulin can also promote the liver to convert the glucose into glycogen. It does this by promoting the activation of an enzyme that performs glycogen synthesis. So one action of insulin is to promote glycogen synthesis in the liver, but the overall action of insulin is to stimulate glucose uptake by most of your body cells. More than just glucose levels can stimulate insulin release, though. For example, elevated levels of amino acids and fatty acids in the blood also stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. This makes sense because usually our meals contain more than just glucose, right? So in general, when organic nutrient levels are high in the blood, insulin will be released. Another stimulation for insulin release is the parasympathetic nervous system. Insulin targets adipose cells to take up fatty acids and take up glycerol to make triglycerides. It also targets skeletal muscle tissue to take up amino acids for synthesizing proteins, to take up glucose for ATP production. And also, just like the liver, skeletal muscle will be stimulated by insulin to make glycogen. So we have glycogen stores in our skeletal muscle as well as in our liver. Not all of the cells in your body need insulin, though, to take up glucose from the blood. The brain, the kidney, liver, and red blood cells don't require insulin to import glucose or to use glucose for ATP synthesis. There's even more detail that we know about how insulin works. We know its mechanism of action at a more molecular level. It involves a glucose transporter called GLUT4. Insulin stimulates a target cell to insert these GLUT4 transporters into its membrane. So in the picture, the GLUT4 transporter is the purple channel that's allowing glucose to cross the cell membrane. The more of those channels that you have, the more glucose can be imported. So insulin stimulates not necessarily the production of those transporters, but definitely inserting the transporters into the membrane. So a step in the production of those GLUT4 transporters. The action of glucagon is to stimulate the liver to break down glycogen. This process is called glycogenolysis. Recall that glycogen is just a chain of multiple glucose molecules. So the glucose that is produced from glycogenolysis in the liver is then transported to the bloodstream, and the overall effect is to raise blood glucose. Like insulin, glucagon secretion is stimulated by more than just blood glucose levels. For example, high levels of amino acids in the blood can stimulate glucagon secretion. Although amino acids could be used by some cells to make ATP, the brain and the kidney, remember, absolutely require glucose. So that won't help them very much. Also, the amino acids can be used, though, for other anabolic needs, like cell and tissue repair. Sympathetic stimulation also causes the release of glucagon. So in order to raise blood glucose and distribute it to all the cells of the body that will be needing to make lots of ATP for the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the release of glucagon to increase that blood glucose level. Okay, now that we understand the two opposing roles of insulin and glucagon, let's look at an endocrine disorder related to insulin. It's diabetes mellitus. This disorder is characterized by decreased insulin secretion, hyposecretion, or in some cases, insulin is secreted, but the body's cells do not react to it. So we call that hypoactivity of insulin. Patients with this disorder present with high blood glucose, hyperglycemia, lots of glucose in the blood, but still weight loss. There isn't fat being deposited from the glucose. Instead, there's weight loss. And excessive thirst, which is called polydipsia, and excessive urination, which is called polyuria. In addition, there's high levels of glucose in the urine and high ketone bodies in the urine, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So some severe complications that can result from having such high glucose levels in the blood relate largely to the nervous system, but other things too. So it can result in adult blindness, renal failure, gangrene, peripheral neuropathy, limb amputations, and cardiovascular degeneration. Well, that, of course, usually occurs in cases where diabetes has not been treated. So the way this disorder presents, I guess, or morphs, is cells aren't importing glucose to use for ATP production. They can't. And that's because insulin is not either available or they're not responding to insulin. So we have high blood glucose. But the cells still need an alternate nutrient source to use for ATP production. So the body begins breaking down fat and protein to provide fuel alternatives. Fat catabolism, for example, results in the production of ketone bodies that are really made in the liver. So first the adipose tissue gets broken down and we get these two carbon groups, acetyl-CoA groups, and the liver then converts those into ketone bodies. These are acids. Okay, so these ketone bodies are acidic. So blood pH drops. And this contributes to the complications we see in untreated diabetes, particularly with the nervous system, like blindness and peripheral neuropathy, because pH does make a difference with the resting membrane potential and how well neurons are able to either be stimulated or conduct impulses. Now, when protein is broken down or protein catabolism occurs, this will result in the production of amino acids, of course, because that's what proteins are made up of. But the liver takes these amino acids and uselessly converts them to glucose. But the cells can't use the glucose. So even though there's plenty of glucose around, you'll still see severe weight loss, and on top of that, you're going to see muscle atrophy because the body is trying to use our protein stores as an alternate energy source. A little bit about these ketone bodies and hyperglycemia. Some of you may have heard of the term ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis, by definition, is low blood pH due to the acidic ketone bodies present in the blood. They can cause an increase in carbon dioxide in the blood. And that's because if you have acid present in the blood, let me see if I can actually draw on this slide so that you'll see it. Good luck with this, right? Okay, so if you have ketone bodies which are acidic, they get converted to this carbonic acid, H2CO3, that you see right there. And that H2CO3 breaks down automatically into water and carbon dioxide. So when you have increased hydrogen ions in the blood, you end up with increased CO2. Now, the consequence of increased CO2 is a patient will increase their respiratory rate. So sometimes somebody with ketoacidosis or untreated diabetes, you'll see that they breathe faster. And that's in an attempt to get rid of the CO2 that has been made in response to the increase in acidity. Okay, another thing that happens with diabetes and these ketone bodies is that you'll see high ketone levels in the blood. You obviously already have high glucose in the blood. And the kidney's job is to filter the blood and either, reabsorb what we need to keep or put wastes into the urine. So there's so many glucose molecules and there's so many ketones. Not that the body really wants to keep them anyway, but the kidney can't reabsorb them all. So you'll see excess glucose and ketones in the urine. The biggest problem is not getting rid of the glucose and the ketones. That's okay because we have an excess. The problem is that often pulls water and electrolytes also into the urine. They're attracted to the glucose and the ketones that are leaving the kidneys, nephrons, and going into the urine. Okay, there's one other disorder that I would like to talk about, and that is diabetes insipidus, mainly because its name is so similar to diabetes mellitus. The symptoms that are noticed right away in diabetes insipidus are polyuria and polydipsia. So excessive urination. In the previous case, we saw that was due to the fact that there's so much glucose and so many ketone bodies that to flush it out, if you will, we get rid of extra water, right? But in this disorder, blood glucose is normal. And there's no glucose in the urine or ketone bodies in the urine. So this disorder is not related to blood glucose regulation at all. It isn't related to a pancreatic hormone at all. Instead, it's caused by hyposecretion of a posterior pituitary hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Normally, antidiuretic hormone, known as ADH, promotes the kidney to reabsorb any water that's being lost to urine back into the bloodstream. So the kidney's filtering the blood. Some water gets lost, but it can be reabsorbed. And ADH promotes that. Without ADH, water from the blood plasma is lost. and it becomes part of the urine. So the patient will experience excessive urination and consequently also be thirsty. Typically their blood volume will go down too. Okay, that's all for the pancreatic hormone lecture. Thank you very much.